Fresh Economic Thinking podcast. New ideas and analysis with Dr. Cameron Murray and Jonathan Gadir.
Welcome back to the Fresh Economic Thinking podcast. You're with Dr. Cameron Murray, and today I've got a special guest, Aidan Morrison. I actually met Aidan online quite a few years ago now, and I believe that when we first encountered each other, we had a bit of a barney about some technical assumptions behind the ABS measurements of resident population. And Aidan, like he does, read all the technical appendices of the ABS documents and made me aware that there was actually a difference between the physically present population and the resident population. So Aidan's the type of guy that really likes to get into the details and doesn't mind, like me, having a bit of a barney in order to get to the bottom of a problem. I wanted to have Aidan on the show today because he's having another barney, but this time with a couple of Australia's major institutions in energy and science, namely CSIRO and AEMO. Aidan, like he does, read all the technical documents and appendices and realized that the story we're hearing about renewables being the lowest cost way to reduce emissions in electricity might just be a convenient story and not what an objective interpretation of the underlying data takes you. Aidan has published some of this analysis on the Fresh Economic Thinking site in July under the title, "The Sunk Cost Trickery That Makes Renewables Seem Cheaper Than They Are." That helped Aidan get some attention, and the barney continues today. So let's dig into some details. Aidan, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Cameron. Really great to be here. Really good.
Maybe we should start. Who are you to think that you can have a barney with Australia's experts in, and I'm using inverted commas with my fingers here, in energy, economics, and policy?
Good question. Look, I'm no one really. Like, I have had a sort of a lay interest in energy for a long time. I don't mind having a disagreement and sort of, swinging hard at an argument, a position. I picked the handle quixotic quant because I think it's just a fun way of describing that attitude, that it's worth just charging at something and seeing what comes crashing down every now and again. So I worked my career mostly as a data scientist in terms of my paid career, but I've had a kind of entrepreneurial and somewhat colorful and interesting background. I owned a bar restaurant for a while and watched a sort of a forecasting tech startup, started to forecast hospitality turnover in small bars and restaurants like the one that I had with some friends in my neighborhood. Worked on a military technology project. It was my biggest, sort of earliest venture. But I don't have any particular industry experience or academic qualification. I just got into a little row on Twitter and decided to read past the executive summary and scratch deep enough and then swing back when I found the arguments that people were using to debunk what I thought was a fairly clear and sensible position were completely unfounded in the details. So that's how it started, just a Twitter argument, and I just kept going, and it sort of snowballed from there.
Wow. A lot of people hate Twitter and they hate the argumentation and the nitpicking, but I think like you, I've found it very good for finding the right people with the right expertise and really narrowing in on their assumptions and the data they're relying on very quickly. So this, I wasn't aware that really you were just, reading about renewable energy and electricity and came across something you thought didn't seem right, and then it snowballed from there.
Yeah. That was right. At the start
what was
of
it
this
that
year,
didn't seem right? What was it?
It was gen cost. I had made the point that the energy transition is going to get harder from here because we'd reached a point where we'd had enough renewables in our system that we could just always basically dial down the existing gas and coal generators to make room for renewables wherever and when they were. And I was sort of conscious that at a certain point, you start having to move energy around in space and time, and that drives up system costs. That means you've got to have more storage and more transmission. because you have too much energy in one place and time, and you need to move it to a different place or time, which is when it is actually needed. And so I made this point in a Twitter argument and said, look, things are going to get harder because as we go higher and higher in terms of the amount of renewables in the system, we'll need more of this. And I had someone swing back and with this king hit slapdown, or so it felt, from the CSIRO Gen Cost. And I hadn't read the report, was barely aware that it existed. And they quoted this graph that showed, and the tweet was something to the effect of, oh, of course we appreciate that's an effect, but it's been quantified by CSIRO. And look here, it's tiny. Don't worry about that at all. They've measured this and they've got the answer, and it's a really, really tiny effect. And so I looked at the graph, and indeed CSIRO claimed to have incorporated the transmission and storage costs, and it was a very tiny effect. And I was perplexed by this and had to momentarily kind of cede the point and say, look, I'm very confused and sorry. And initially I thought that they hadn't incorporated the full costs, and then I read the paragraph above and it looked like they had. And then I decided to read the full report and look for where their methodology for producing that graph was. And I discovered they had omitted all the heavy lifting up to 2030 and treated that as a sunk cost in a business as usual scenario. And so then I decided to write the thread that kind of really took off and kicked off this whole process. And you kindly republished a better version of on Fresh Economic Thinking. So that's where it started. Yeah.
So can I just dig into this, because I think we need to really lay out the physics of the problem, and I think that's where you came from. You understood that the trick with renewable energy is it's variable over time, and variable energy and stable, reliable energy are not the same thing. Variable energy comes at different places and at different times. And so you have to move it through transmission wires or store it in batteries or pumped hydro so that you can use it when it's needed. And so you came with this sort of clear physical reality that if a little bit of your generation is variable, then you only have to move a little bit of that variable energy around. So taking the solar from the day to the evening or from one location to another. But when it's a huge part of the generation, you have to move a huge amount of energy around. Is that a good way of describing the problem that you had in your mind? And
it's even more it's more acute than that. Even if you have a little bit of energy that you can't control, the variable energy that you can't control, and that's the key thing. It's not so much that it's variable, is that you can't control when it varies, right? So if there's a little bit of energy that you can't control, you can take whatever arrives, whenever it arrives, and slot that into your system by just reducing the bit that you can control and turning that down. So a little bit doesn't need to be moved at all. You just accept it on your rooftop solar panel, on the nearest wind farm, and it just goes into the grid. And whatever electrons were flowing there before, you just turn them back, because you can do that for some energy sources. Right. And you just make the new stuff to slot in. So there is no moving around of the first bit of variable renewable energy at all. It's only at the point, which is the point that Australia and a few other Western countries or jurisdictions are reaching now, when you get to the point where you've got enough wind and solar that on a nice, bright, windy day, you have more than enough energy at one place at that time. Then you need to start moving energy around. And that tends to be around the 30% to 40% level where you start to really need to move energy around. So we've seen nothing yet. And everyone that says, oh, renewables have been growing so fast and renewables have been, seem so cheap. Yep. They're quite right. That's how they have been till now. But that means nothing about what the next 60% of the decarbonisation process looks like, because it's only just starting to get hard.
And so so you're saying we're just starting a point where we have to move energy around, and there's a huge cost in terms of transmission lines, pumped hydro, batteries, things. And so if I'm understanding correctly, when you read CSIRO's report, they assumed away these costs.
Yep, that's right.
Can you explain what they did?
Yeah. So for some reason, actually, they've clarified this reason. they wanted to, because they understood the hypothesis that I hold and that it is true, is that it's the high levels of renewable energy where the costs become greater. They decided they would try to calculate what the cost would be of integrating the next bit of renewables when you already had quite a bit of renewables in the grid. And they chose 55% roughly and 2030 as the time when they would say, we're going to start thinking about the cost from that point onwards. But then they used, I think, a completely dishonest and deceptive sleight of hand where they said, we're going to start the clock at 2030 and just presume that everything that we've built in the previous decade that we required because we're going to keep building renewables, in particular, massive interconnectors in the transmission network between New South Wales and Victoria and linking up the Snowy Hydro scheme and the Snowy Hydro Dam itself and another link to Tasmania and another future pumped hydro scheme in Tasmania. All of those, because we're going to build them in before 2030, we're going to remove them from the cost of all the other variable renewable energy that's going to come after it. And that, to me, is indefensible, absolutely indefensible, because you build infrastructure before you need it. You can't use it while you're building it. So you weren't building all those projects in the 2030s because of the energy that you already had connected in the 2030s. You're building them for the stuff you're about to connect in the in the 2020s. You're building them for the stuff that comes after that. So that cost is justified by the later stuff, and they just completely removed that. They treated it as a business as usual and a sunk cost. And they justified that by saying, just recently, it's come out in a press release in October, they said that that was because they were only considering the cost of renewables to an energy investor in 2030. So CSIRO has now admitted they were not considering the cost of energy for the end user. They weren't considering the cost of renewables for the whole system. They weren't considering the broader public good. They were only considering the costs of renewables to a private investor entering the market. And that was their basis for basically removing the costs, assuming to be zero, the costs of all the stuff that consumers would have to commit to paying for before then, or taxpayers would pay for, which I think is indefensible. But that's now come out as the clarification of why they did that.
So let me just summarize my understanding. The interconnectors are those high voltage power lines on those massive, frames that you see going across the countryside. Is that right?
That's right, yeah.
And so we're building heaps of them, aren't we? Out to all the places where there'll be solar areas and wind farms and connecting New South Wales to Queensland. They are the costs that we're going to spend today, and then we're going to pretend that connecting those what do they call them? Renewable energy zones with those massive power lines. We're going to pretend that those costs don't count when it comes to the renewable energy from those zones. Is that basically right?
That's basically right. Yeah.
And then the trick is that for the consumer of electricity, when we calculate the regulated price, we add those costs in to make sure, we get paid. The public gets paid. But for the generator, if I was starting a new wind farm, because I wouldn't be paying that cost, it looks like it's cheap for me because the consumer gets to pay the transmission cost. I don't have to pay it. So it looks like, I just put some solar panels on a farm and plug in. Look how cheap that was.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the reason that's really significant, well, there's more to it even than that, because you can measure the cost of electricity at the power station gate. It's called the wholesale price, how much it costs for them to produce it and send it into the grid. But the cost of electricity that we pull out of the power point in the wall is more than that. It's the cost of what it took for the power producer to send it out the gate of their power station into the grid. And it's the cost of all the wires that get it from the power station to our home, right? And that's both. It's two different networks. We call them the transmission network, which is high voltage, and then the distribution network, which is the ones that are the smaller towers in your street. They're the low voltage ones. But we have to pay for both those costs. And then sometimes we have to pay for additional environmental policies and subsidies on top of that. That's a smaller cost as well. Things like the LRET, things like that. So I think that's the name of the acronym. And then there's also the retailers. They have to make a margin as well. So the cost that we pay is not the same as the cost of the generator sending it out. And the reason it's really significant is because the system that CSIRO has tried to price in their Gen Cost report is the system is essentially giving a guide to how much the electricity generators can promise they will charge to push it into the grid. It hasn't got to do with what people will have to pay, consumers in particular, to take it out. It also, they are able to finance their projects on these contracts, these basically power purchase agreements. And so if they can assume that someone else is paying for all the transmission projects in a regulatory base, it helps to make it look very cheap for them to say, oh, well, we're producing power quite cheaply because someone else is meeting the cost of those distribution networks. So it helps to create the impression that renewables are cheap because of their at the power station gate costs being identified, not what it takes to pull the power out of the wall socket costs.
And so let's just say you've got this stack of costs for the consumer when you pay at your house your electricity. Let's just say I'm paying $100 of electricity. How much of that 100 is the generation of power, and how much is the rest, the transmission, the levies, the retail, and managing my account? What's the ballpark there?
Split the generation is about 40%.
Generation is 40%, so it's less than half.
That's right. Less than half of your power bill price is the actual power. More than half is what it takes to get the power to you.
Okay. So the bulk of the cost is not putting energy in at one end, but transmitting it and managing the accounts and the distribution of it. So when the CSIRO says it's cheap, well, the smallest component is reasonably cheap, but what they're doing is they're adding more cost to the larger component and not telling anyone about it.
That's exactly correct. Exactly correct. And the same thing is replicated as well in the AEMO integrated system plan, where they assume, for example, that the biggest single part, which is the distribution network costs, are fixed. No matter how many new electric cars we add, no matter how much electrification of heating we add, no matter how many power walls, no matter what rate and speed we need to discharge and recharge all those power walls off each other, the distribution network costs they assume to be fixed throughout the entire period of modeling out to 2050, when in fact the reality is the distribution networks are raising their prices and flagging they intend to raise their prices in the next regulatory period right now to accommodate exactly those things. And they quote AEMO's ISP and the targets for distributed energy resources as the reason for raising prices in the next regulatory period. So that's exactly it, and it is absurd and unreasonable as that.
And so CSIRO, let me just get all the acronyms together, is the Commonwealth Science and Industrial Research Organization, if I've remembered. They're a federal government scientific body. Right. What was their involvement? Which report did they produce and why?
Yeah. Their involvement is to produce the report called Gen Cost, which is the cost of generating the electricity. There's a nexus between that report and the report that's produced by AEMO. AEMO is the Australian Energy Market Operator, and they produce the ISP, which is the Integrated System Plan. Now, the reason these two are linked is because Gen Cost considers the capital costs of building the power station, and they also try to calculate the levelized cost of energy, which includes not just the capital cost, but also the fuel costs, maintenance costs, and life cycle costs, as in when you have to dispose of the power plant, how long it lasts for, etc. So that's the average price at the power station gate, if you like, of producing the electricity over the life cycle of a plant. And they produce that. The reason they collaborate with the ISP that's produced by AEMO is that they have attempted to do this adjustment for levelized cost of electricity, which doesn't attempt to incorporate the effect of the intermittent nature of renewables. They're trying to adjust for that, or they're claiming they're trying to adjust for that by incorporating the costs of extra transmission, storage, and firming power, the backup generators when there's not enough wind and solar. And they need to refer to AEMO's much more complex in-depth report, the ISP, to figure out how much batteries we are likely to need at some year in the future, and how much extra pumped hydro we're likely to need at some year in the future. And that's the link that they have with the ISP. And they're quoting the ISP and saying, oh, look, if we just jump forward to the ISP projections at 2030, oh, it turns out we don't need to build quite as many new big interconnectors between the states at that point, because they're already built. And so we won't add any new costs there for the next bit of renewables. And similarly, they also replicate other major assumptions of the ISP. So, for example, the vast majority of the battery storage that's used to store power from renewables is actually in what we call behind the meter storage, which is power walls and Teslas, like electric cars that are plugged back in to support the grid.
Right.
The ISP does not incorporate that as a cost, because they assume that consumers are going to buy them anyway and provide those services back to the grid of their own accord without any sort of payment or incentive structure that represents a system cost. So
let me just
CSIRO replicates that mistake as well and doesn't incorporate the cost of most of the batteries.
So let me just be clear. You just said that we are assuming that we don't need as much transmission for the extra variable renewal. Sorry, you were saying these reports assume we don't need as much transmission because they instead assume that every household will have a battery that will help reduce the variability of the grid, and that cost is just ignored.
Yep.
Okay, amazing. Okay, I'm going to maybe take it up a level here. So you've read these reports in probably about as much detail as anyone except the authors of the report, which is actually the norm, I think, in a lot of these big technical documents produced by these agencies. So I want to sort of speculate on the sort of political pressures involved. But firstly, I want to say, if you had all the information they had, and now that you've read more than anyone, how different would, if you wrote the report, right? These reports, the gen cost, which is the cost of generation, how different would it look in terms of the story that we're sold that, renewables are the cheapest transition path? How different? Like quite a lot, just a little bit? Is this a huge issue?
I think very, very different. Renewables look cheap when you've just got a little bit of them in the system, like at that point before you start moving them around. So I think if I was writing the gen cost report, there's two approaches you can take. You can either say we're just calculating the levelized cost of energy and we're not trying to incorporate how complex things get when you go to high levels of renewables. And lots of reports do this, right? It's very common for reports that try to add up the cost of electricity, like Lazards, for example. They will produce a report that is heavily disclaimed and say, there are other costs associated, do not rely on this for purposes other than certain purposes that it's useful for. Or they'll put in a additional, it's kind of a token, but maybe useful amount of attributed storage and say, we're not building out the full system, but if you added a little bit of storage to help here, this is how it changes the cost, which is sort of a token step in the right direction, but it doesn't mean you're going to have reliable electricity from that source. It's just a step in the right direction. It's sort of a common kind of pairing. And so you can do those kind of steps and just say, I'm not doing the full deep dive into how our full system works, and just say, here's an estimate of just the levelized cost of energy and minor tweaks to it. Or you can do it properly and do what they call a levelized full system cost of energy, where you do attempt to figure out the full cost of the system, including all the distribution networks and all the storage, and calculate the cost of the entire system. Gen cost has done this awkward halfway step in between, which does not match any academic or industry standard anywhere in the world, so far as I can tell. It's a total outlier that's tried to do a bigger than usual correction, but based on a sort of a full system design that doesn't incorporate half the costs of the system anyway. And so they've landed in this completely strange space. But I would think that if I was doing the analysis and trying to incorporate the full costs, you'd find that renewables noticeably above 50% start to become very expensive indeed.
And what alternative becomes cheaper? That's my question.
Good.
I have in mind, for example, if transmission costs get so high, is switching from coal to gas at the same facility, at the same location that's already connected to the same transmission lines, a good way to reduce emissions at low cost? Is that what you think?
I think
so?
that's a the cost of gas is an extremely significant sensitivity there. So
okay.
it might not be low cost depending on how much your gas costs. That's a key thing. And in Australia, we don't burn currently a very big volume of gas. So if we wanted to switch all our coal to gas power generation, for example, we'd have to do a bit of work to figure out where that gas comes from. And that might actually be developing new fields or figuring out how to, I don't know, import it or pipe it from some of the export projects we have, or rewriting those project costs. So that's not a simple and obvious, would be cheaper one. Although you could definitely cut carbon emissions significantly, roughly in half, by switching just from coal to gas, which is a significant one. And the other one, of course, to think about, which we're not allowed to think about properly in Australia, because it's still banned, is to think about nuclear, because nuclear has very low operating costs once you've built it. All the costs are kind of front-loaded. It's complicated and expensive to build it and verify that you built them safely and correctly. Once they're built, though, they're just a dream to run and really great for the grid. And the amount of fuel they require is so small as the overall proportion that fluctuations in the price of uranium don't really change the price of electricity very much at all. So that's the other thing that would probably become very cost competitive if you try to decarbonize. And of course, nuclear has basically zero carbon emissions. There's just the embodiment of the concrete, which is only 6 grams or so per kilowatt hour, as opposed to 1,000 for coal. So it's a huge difference.
And my understanding is that the lifetime of a nuclear plant, once you've built it, is much, much longer than the lifetime of a wind farm or a solar farm. And and I think people think with solar, you build the panels and it's set and forget. But solar and wind are actually build the turbines and the panels plus the extra transmission and storage and everything as a bundle. Whereas nuclear, it's just the facility, and it's not this transmission bundle, because that's not needed. And so when you want to comparing like for like, you need to include those sunk costs. So if we really did a like for like with nuclear, well, we could just basically say, the concrete is a sunk cost. Only the stuff after we've poured the concrete is is the generation cost, the turbine or the reactor, right? Couldn't we?
You could do a number of things like that. All the regulatory costs, you could sink whatever costs you like if they want to do it the same way that they've done it for renewables, which is just incredible.
So I feel like there's and I've been involved in government departments where there is a political pressure to say, hey, this is the way we're going, like it or not. Can you please write reports that fit the way we're going? So I get there's I don't know what to call this phenomenon, but when a technical discussion or debate gets a political flavor, all of a sudden it becomes very, very hard to have honest technical debates still. I don't know what this pattern should be called, but I'll work on it. And another case of that you discovered, and I just want to sort of wrap up with this, is this switching to gas idea. So same sort of idea of switching off gas, for residential use. Grattan Institute wrote a report, which is, we've sort of decided politically we're getting off fossil fuels, right? And they wrote a report about switching to gas for residential homes, and particularly in Victoria. And that's another one that you read to the appendices. And it had a similar sort of pattern of putting some weird assumptions in and then almost ignoring your own results. What was the story there?
Grattan's report that supported the kind of in placement of a gradual ban on installing new gas appliances, etc., in Victoria. It was an absolute shocker. From the very start, they started with this opening statement about how significant the gas contribution to carbon emissions was, but actually the number they had there, 22%, was for all our nation's emissions of gas, and that is almost entirely from industrial and export purposes. and power generation, and almost none of it is from the actual gas burned in the home. It's about 2% of Australia's carbon emissions that come from gas burnt in the home. Most of that's in Victoria. And so they started with just kind of like, I mean, the start of any kind of policy proposal should be, how big's the prize? Why does this matter? And they just completely skipped over the fact that they were focusing now on the smallest little edge case of the prize, and they were ignoring the rest of it. And then they proceeded to, basically, their analysis showed that if we switched a gas heating and burning household for hot water and everything to, and cooking and heating, to an electric home that had state-of-the-art, best heat pump appliances, amazing efficiency levels, you'd still emit more carbon in Victoria today, because all of the carbon dioxide that's produced by burning brown coal, the amount of brown coal they burn in Victoria, would be worse than the gas burned in the home. And that makes perfect sense thermodynamically, because actually gas is quite a clean fuel. And when you burn it right next to the thing you're trying to heat up, when your end product is heat, that is so much more efficient than you burning it in a power station to create steam, to spin a turbine, to create electricity, to send down a wire, to get to your home, to heat in an element, another wire, to create heat. It's actually very efficient to just burn it next to the thing you're trying to heat up, which is what you do when you heat your dinner or your shower water, using that. So it requires basically these tremendous assumptions about having the best, most amazing, consistently installed state-of-the-art heat pump appliances in every electric home. And also the most outrageous assumption, which I'm absolutely gobsmacked by, is this assumption as well that the electricity that you draw to power those appliances when you turn them on will represent the average amount of electricity, average amount of carbon emissions of a grid that has some wind and solar in it, when in fact the heating demand in particular is a very peaky load, very seasonal, and it happens to come when we have the worst amount of sunshine in the least sunny state. And you would probably be, at the times when you want to turn on and increase the new demand from your extra heating and extra cooking requirements, you'd probably be turning on more gas-fired or coal-fired power generation in the grid. And this is an absolutely shocking marginal versus average mistake that they have made. It's a hard error. It's an absolutely factual error in their analysis. And they've just failed to consider it at all. And so it would actually probably push Victoria's carbon emissions up substantially for probably several decades still to switch to gas. And yet the conclusion was, we have to do this anyway. It's going to happen. And they kind of twisted and bent their conclusions and walked back previous analysis of their own about the cost of the distribution network that we required to have that increase in peaky electricity demand in winter. So a really, really shocking report from an organization that I once had a lot of time for and respect for in terms of the quality of, or the content of their analysis and the way they tended to lay things out.
It's funny that you mentioned, stop burning gas in the home, start burning brown coal in the evenings in winter in Victoria. A friend of mine often says to me, I said, "Oh, why don't you get a Tesla?" He works in the coal industry, and he goes, "Yeah, I probably should get a coal-powered car instead of a petrol-powered one, shouldn't I?" And this substitution into the electricity and increasing demand there, I think we need to be a little bit honest that about the way things are and the cost to get to the way we want things to be when it comes to electricity. And I think these are two examples, one relatively minor, the Grattan report, and one pretty substantial and institutional that has really drifted away from, I don't know, more concrete and honest analysis, and really into reflecting back to us the politics of the day, which I think is a bit unfortunate.
Indeed.
Is there anything you want to add in 30 seconds or less that maybe you think is important for the audience to appreciate or reiterate?
I think you've said it very well. I mean, it's always worth reading things in detail. And as well, the more that I've looked at this and scratched the surface, I've realized that I'm actually not the first to have read some of the detail quite a bit better. There's been a lot of official submissions that have been put into the CSIRO and AEMO by other people that have noticed problems as well. And I'm deeply concerned by the response that they have been given often. And that's really I suppose, worrying and upsetting, and confirms potentially the worst of your fears about things being politically determined from above and prior to the actual analysis being done, that serious analysis and submissions are sort of swept aside or given a token dismissal, which is a real shame. So read all those too, read the submissions and consultation processes. It's very enlightening.
Terrific. Well, the Barney today was Aidan's Barney with many institutions in Australia. It's been a pleasure to have you on and really get to those details. That's what it's all about here at Fresh Economic Thinking, and I look forward to chatting again.
Thanks very much, Cameron. It's been great.